Welcome today to our Information Security Summit presentation. Today's topic is DevSecOps Assessment and Maturity Model, and our presenters today are Frank Yako and John Meyer. So take it away, John.
Yeah, I'd just like to welcome everybody to the DevSecOps Assessment and Maturity Model presentation. It's being presented by ASMGi. My name is John Meyer. I'm the Solutions Architect at ASMGi. And then we also have Frank Yako joining us. He's the CIO and Director of Strategic Initiatives. Frank, I don't know if you want to give any background on yourself.
Sure, John. Thanks for having me, and we look forward to presenting today. Again, as John mentioned, my name is Frank Yako, responsible for both our CIO role at ASMGi, as well as strategic initiatives from both an internal facing and customer facing perspective. Have had an opportunity to play different roles in the IT industry over time on both the buy and sell side of the equation, and try to apply some of that experience to the work that we do with our clients. Thanks for having me, John.
Yep. Yeah, so my background, I've been in infrastructure. I've worked for some software development companies. So kind of ran the gamut, been in some DevOps organizations, involved in some DevSecOps. So, to kind of transition that into our agenda today, what we're trying to really cover in this presentation is really what does it mean to move left or move to DevSecOps. Going over our objectives for this presentation as well, giving you an overview of the software development lifecycle. I think that one's going to be pretty key just as a starting point to understand how DevOps and DevSecOps really came about and what the drivers were for that. Also, getting into what DevOps is and why it was adopted, and noting that, that doesn't say DevSecOps is because before there was DevSecOps, DevOps was really probably, the birth of all of this. So, and then the next objective would be, how do we go from DevOps to DevSecOps? And then what are some of the methods to determine DevSecOps maturity? And finally, how does an organization assess DevSecOps maturity and ultimately apply it in a meaningful way?
So, John, before we jump into what DevSecOps is and what it means, what is this session? Who is this audience, and who do we hope to communicate with today?
Yeah, so I think the audience we really want to communicate to, it's I would say pretty broad. Obviously Information Security Summit, we're looking at security folks, but I think a lot of this resonates with anybody that's part of the software development lifecycle, whether it's developers, operations, and security, because really the whole the biggest aspect of this is how are we going to introduce security to the software development lifecycle as a whole. So hopefully there's a little bit for everybody in this.
Great, thanks. That's important, I think, to emphasize is that, and based on obviously what you'll be explaining is what DevSecOps is that this is a cross-functional, organization-wide type of topic.
Absolutely. I mean, this can definitely be seen as a cultural shift within an organization on some levels, given what it entails. So, I guess to kind of kick that off is, what does it mean to move to the left? It's actually more of a literal terminology. Security traditionally in an operational sense, or later in a DevOps sense, it was developers make the software, they compile it, operations assist with deploying it, and then you had security running scans or running pen tests, and then you'd find your vulnerabilities. This literally means moving security to the left in that nomenclature. So DevSecOps, where we're introducing security into the process, into the middle of the process, in the heart of it all. So the objectives that we want to try to meet with this is to provide an overview and an introduction to DevOps and DevSecOps. We want to discuss the reasons why an organization would consider adopting DevSecOps. And we want to compare the differences between DevOps and DevSecOps, explore how to begin moving to DevSecOps or moving to the left, moving security to the left, and how an organization integrates DevSecOps and matures. And as I said before, a lot of this is going to have something for everybody, because, you know, not that everyone's got to be a you know, security engineer, but there's definitely involvement that will likely be required from all levels of the software development lifecycle. So, as I said, you know, given a little background on software development lifecycle, I think is going to be the first key to this presentation for those that might not be overly familiar with the DevSecOps or the software development lifecycle. You know, especially people that might be a little more siloed or divorced from it. There's several different types of methodologies. The first one, and probably one of the more popular ones, would be the waterfall methodology of software development. This tends to be a more siloed methodology where, you know, you complete one step before moving to the next in its entirety. And so, you know, you know, in this case, gather your requirements. That's done. You start the design process. That's done. You implement. That's done, so on and so forth. So I don't want to say legacy is a bad term that I used on this slide, because it's not, because this is a traditional software development methodology, but it's still very commonly used. And the important thing to remember too is that all these software development methodologies can incorporate DevOps in them. It's not just you know, one particular methodology can only be used, you know, in a DevOps capacity. But this is, you know, typically the way things were done, and there are still use cases for it. Waterfall, if you've got, you know, projects with clearly defined and unchanging requirements, a lot of it makes a lot of sense, because you can control, you know, the budget better, you can control timelines better, or projects that have to adhere to multiple rules and regulations. The other thing that comes to mind, and, you know, this last point where it says projects are a well-known technology, you know, projects where a well-known technology stack or tools are used, out of the box software. So if you've got software that also incorporates elements of box software, typically, you know, those are static applications where an update's released every so often, and that's the way those go. So following up to that would be a V model, and you'll notice there's a lot of redundancy built into that. So it's very similar in a lot of ways to the waterfall, but with all that redundancy, it's not necessary for every project. So, you know, as you would think, projects where failures or downtimes are largely unacceptable, the V model is a good model because of all those redundancies. What I termed alternative software development methodologies, really it's more microservices based or web services based, using function apps and stuff like that, serverless, if you will. Iterative models, incremental models. This is a model where multiple facets can be worked on at the same time in tandem with each other. And use cases where this is good is large mission critical enterprise applications, applications that are loosely, you know, that have loosely coupled parts. Finally, kind of getting to the more popular ones that I think a lot of you will probably recognize now, or, you know, as we like to term them, modern software development methodologies. Scrum, which is also known as Agile, consisting of a lot of continuous operations throughout the software development lifecycle. So it'll, you know, the term sprints is used a lot because you can have multiple teams working on different things at the same time, different sprints, if you will, at the same time. And so as that kind of suggests, you know, startup initiatives, you know, we see a lot of startups use this methodology, projects where a lot of user feedback is required, mid-sized projects where business requirements are a little bit foggy sometimes or don't necessarily translate very well to the software requirements. But also large projects that can be divided, as is the nature of having the different sprints. You can have one agile team, for instance, working on one aspect of the software while another agile team works on another. The spiral method, probably not something a lot of people see a lot very often. It's more complex. It's got a lot more security checks in it, but to me, it has a lot of relation to the Scrum and Agile method as well. But as you can see with the complexities in the graphic itself, projects that are a little ambiguous, or projects that are large and complicated, projects relating to research and development are what that methodology applies to a lot of times.
Well, John, I know. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, before we move on, I was going to turn it over to you just to kind of give some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's no doubt that Agile is really popular out there today, and for the requirements of quote unquote speed. There's the iterative activities that occur as far as smaller releases and things that organizations want to deploy as a result of identifying features or new capabilities versus more of a monolithic approach to deploying capabilities as part of a larger release. But oddly enough, if you really look at it, what is absent from the process? Security, and in some cases operations as well. So that's the one. It's be careful what you ask for type of thing. With speed, you have to balance that with the risk that you're assuming, and without embedding some type of security and operational component, there is a kind of a false sense of gain or benefit. So that's something that and again, this is the whole reason for having the conversation is exactly how to balance the speed versus the risk that you're assuming. So just definitely something we'll touch on as we go forward.
Absolutely. Sorry about that. I hit my arrow button and sped forward, but getting to our next slide, as it says, developers and operations were the first on the scene. We all know this typical function. Developer creates the software, compiles it, works with operations to deploy it. So how do we make that more streamlined? How do we introduce a more cohesive way of releasing software in a more frequent release cycle? We can couple these two together, and DevOps was born out of that. It was really out of a necessity to streamline those processes in the software development lifecycle, get releases out faster, get the frequency of releases up more, so that more features could be added faster and more bug fixes could be put out there faster for a better overall user experience. When asked why DevOps was adopted, when a lot of companies were polled, these are a lot of the reasons that they came up with. And as you can see, I mean, it's exactly that. It's improving agility, whether it's business agility or just agility within the software development process, improving the reliability of the applications, the frequency of release, cost reduction, user experience. Those just to name a few of the big ones and the major reasons why people shifted to that. So there's definitely a compelling reason to switch to the DevOps method, but we also need to be cognizant of security. So where does that fit in? We need to put security on the scene. So we all know we had developers and operations working together, and then the CISO would come in and there's an audit or whatever. How do we ease the pressure of that? We introduce security in between all this. We put security into every process. We integrate it seamlessly, and DevSecOps is born. So that graphic that we showed earlier it kind of turns into something like this. And I know this looks a lot more complicated, but really it's the same 8 phases we were looking at before. You know, it's still planning, coding, testing, releasing, operations, and operating and monitoring. The only thing we did was we introduced some of those security processes and protocols into the mix. You know, we kind of spliced up that the DevOps model, and we introduced IDE security. We introduced code scans. We introduced threat modeling and things of that nature into the phases themselves. So it's still, you know, as DevSecOps still takes those same principles, and it just applies security tooling and security principles seamlessly throughout the process. And we do this really to ensure business application and operational security. You know, and as
one question going back to that slide. So with the idea of adding those security steps as part of the different you know, activities that were part of the DevOps cycle, is that what you're referring to as far as moving things to the left? You know what you mentioned about the scenario of security getting engaged, you know, right at the time of production, and you know, so how does that term "move to the left" apply in this graphic, and maybe even cite a few examples?
Yep. So usually, you know, this would be almost like you can think of it as a straight line. So we go from development to deployment, and then you've got, you know, going to the right, and then you've got security at the end there doing their scans, doing their pen testing and stuff like that. We have literally and figuratively moved security to the left in here in, you know, every single phase. So in the plan phase, we've got, you know, a list of things we can do that are security related to make sure that we're planning the software development in a secure manner. In the coding phase, we can have IDE security plugins from, you know, whether it's a software composition analysis tool or a static scan tool. We can implement those plugins so that we can actually scan the code while it's being written. In the test phase, you know, or you know, later on in the code phase, we can employ static code scans of the repositories, dynamic scans of the URLs, you know, software composition analysis we can run against either the repositories or the pipelines, you know, and then on through even, you know, release in the test phase. So in the test phase, we can run automated testing, you know, integration testing, dependency testing, all that stuff. You know, when we go to the release and the delivery, we can run software composition analysis tools, for instance, right within the pipeline. So all those phases literally have their own security processes that we can build into them in an automated fashion, so that not only does the whole software development lifecycle become more secure, we still keep it seamless, and it kind of almost takes it takes a lot of the worry out of the security aspect of things when it comes to, you know, wondering whether your application is secure, or even in some instances meeting some audit criteria.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that, you know, with what you're describing, I mean, it takes a lot of the pressure off of the security team, you know, in the downstream portion of the development life cycle. And then, you know, also, you know, if there were risks associated with even the architecture or the design of the application, I would have to believe that those things would be identified way upstream in the life cycle versus, you know, once the design was set and the supporting architecture was set, you know, which certainly induces a lot of cost if you have to undo something, you know, way downstream, you know, in a more traditional approach. So it just seems logical that this would be, you know, not only more secure approach, but also, you know, more cost effective as well. So, you know, reducing or eliminating any kind of re-engineering or redevelopment of a solution or infrastructure.
Oh, for sure. and that kind of brings us to our next slide. I wouldn't say that DevSecOps alone is going to make you, pass a security audit or, meet a compliance standard by itself. But when, respondents were reached out to that work in organizations that have DevSecOps or DevOps models in place, a good percentage of those people in those different organizations work under compliance standards such as ISO, HIPAA, PCI, Sarbanes-Oxley, and SOC, and the list goes on. So, they're adopting this model because it helps them at least meet those audit criteria. It makes it a lot less, there's a lot less thought involved in it because, once you're getting those audits and stuff like that, if you've got to pull up some kind of tracking or user tracking, it's a lot easier to present that evidence for an audit because you have those security protocols throughout every process or phase within the model, within the software development lifecycle.
Yeah, it's almost like you're instrumenting the development cycle so that you can, provide that evidence for an audit or any type of requirements that might be driven by the business or even client, requirements as well. So that's excellent.
Yeah, as processes are automated, as we codify more aspects of the software development lifecycle, it definitely presents a lot more ease in presenting evidence for audits or tracking and accountability. So I guess that kind of brings us, what does it mean to mature in DevSecOps? How does an organization start this and what do they have to do to become more mature? It starts with governance. That's going to be our umbrella over everything. That governance is really the umbrella around the proper people, process, and technology. So finding the right balance and distribution of roles, that's the people. It's not to say that you're going to have a separate position title for everything. There's obviously in organizations today, a lot of people wear multiple hats. It's just making sure that you have somebody that can fill the proper role to meet, a requirement or be able to do a process within any of those DevSecOps phases. Successful integration of security controls and tools throughout the DevSecOps tool chain. So you've got the right people, you've got the roles in place, got to make sure they have the proper tools to do the job. And then, using DevSecOps practices and automation to substitute traditional controls, that's your process. We have the right roles, we have the right tools. Those right tools are the tools we use to automate. Those are the tools that we use to codify the software development lifecycle, whether it's, security as code, infrastructure as code, the software development code, source coding itself. It's making sure that everybody has the proper tools and the proper integrations, plugins to ensure that secure lifecycle. Validating and measuring the success of DevSecOps compliance efforts by continually monitoring the status of compliance. So if you've got these compliance standards that you've got to adhere to, the key to that is having effective monitoring and constantly having checks on your process so that at any given point in time, it shouldn't be a question of whether you're compliant. You should be able to prove at any given time that you're compliant with the standard that you have to be. And then once you have all those tools in place and you've got the processes and the people in place and everything's running smoothly, that then allows you to go to the next step and scale that compliance, scale the compliance practices across the organization. And some of that's done by leveraging compliance specific software, and some of it's just being able to scale your own processes.
Yeah, I think the comment that you made about governance is extremely critical because this is something that is, as we've discussed and described, something that's cross-functional, cross-organizational, And, so having that governance in place, having the ability to have the different perspectives at the table, understanding the impact that it has on the organization, making sure that it has management support and visibility. And then, I know we haven't talked about it yet, but the last point about the compliance practices, having those individuals have the seat at the table to make sure that they're represented in the development life cycle. Because as we know, there's more and more controls and requirements and expectations placed on organizations today, and it can't just be an afterthought for meeting those requirements as well. So by doing the things that we're describing with instrumenting the development cycle, knowing that you have to meet certain compliance standards, that allows you to demonstrate those types of requirements as well. And then having that governance structure in place to help to prioritize various initiatives, as well as, when you're mentioning about the people, we know that there's a lot of cross training involved in adopting something like this, and even potentially new roles within an organization. So, the point that you make about the people, process, technology, it truly has to hit all three of those areas. And then, with governance as the oversight with that process and to help to drive that change. So all great points.
Yeah, it really is three legs of a stool: people, process, technology. If you're missing one, it's not gonna be so good. That brings us to our next slide. How do you begin that journey? How do you, you've got to start somewhere. You've got to figure out what you need. So we want to understand why. We want to make that business justification. A lot of these things require something important to the business in order to get kicked off, and that's going to be probably, that's definitely reason number one up there. Assessment. What does an assessment look like? How do we figure out what our current state is and what our desired future state is? Identifying the gaps and proposing solutions, that's something that will come out of the assessment, and we'll be able to gauge what we have to fix, or what we have to implement, or what processes we already are doing to get us down the road. Building a roadmap. Obviously this is something that has many different facets. The model itself has those 8 phases. You got to kind of look at this incrementally. You can't do it all at once. It's going to be a change over time, but best way to look at it is no better time than now. If something's going to take 2 years to do, it's going to take 2 years, whether you start it now or 2 years from now. So I think that's, one of the most important things is just to find a starting point, making the business justification, and actually getting started down the path. What does a assessment look like? It's the first, that's the second question we asked on that slide, is what does an assessment look like? So we know that there's these phases in a DevOps a DevOps model. So we can take those phases, and just like, any other criteria, there's requirements to meet a criteria. So we can take those phases, like the planning phase or the development phase, and we can break those out into a set of requirements that need to be met in order to say that we've completed that phase. Those requirements, in order to meet those, you're going to need people, you're going to need processes. There's going to, we can even break that out further into sub-processes. So if it's, designing something, well, what do you have to do to design it? And then finally, the technology, the tools to do the job. The other aspect of this is, once you know the requirements that are needed to complete a phase in this model, what phase do you, what requirements do you start with first? An easy way to look at that is, well, what's the most risky to the business? If there's a requirement in the development phase, for instance, that's leaves a significant security loophole in your development practice, that might be a high risk item. Whereas, converting a manual task to an automated task, isn't maybe necessarily as much of a concern. you know, it's something you want to do, but it's not an inherent security risk in the right here and now. The next aspect to look at is a maturity level. So again, kind of taking the example of manual versus automated, you know, maybe you have a process like unit testing or something that you do, or regression testing that you do manually right now. You're at a certain maturity level with that because you are doing it. But if you automated it, you'd be at a higher maturity level. So kind of taking what you're doing or finding what you're not doing and assessing a maturity level to that would be, you know, one of the next things that you can look at. And then finally, putting a priority on the things that you find with the assessment. So, or on these requirements that need to be done. And you know, those priorities levels might not necessarily be mutually exclusive with either risk or maturity. You know, it's definitely, when you think of priority, you got to think about, you know, what's the business case for it, the justification, the cost possibly behind it. You know, all those things are going to affect the priority a little bit. So that's why I say it might not necessarily be mutually exclusive to a risk or a maturity level. So, you know, this is just, you know, an example of what an assessment would look like, you know, being able to just take each of those phases and break it out and figure out, you know, where are you at now with that phase, and how can you really say that you complete that phase. One of the best ways to do this is just developing a systematic process behind that. So, you know, you'll notice some graphics on here or whatever, just as kind of an example of a way that you can kind of divide and you know, all these things up. You know, similar to the graphic in the last slide, this is really just a process oriented illustration of that. So we list our phase. You know, we've got, you know, the planning phase, for instance. We list requirements for each phase. So one of the requirements, you know, out of, you know, there might be many. There might be a dozen requirements to really say that you complete the planning phase. One of those requirements, you know, might be this, you know, designing process and workflows. You know, what's the process for that? Designing the DevSecOps ecosystem. How do you do that? What roles are needed to complete this list of sub-processes? And then what tools would they need? So, you know, listing, you know, the requirements, listing the processes, listing the organization roles needed to satisfy, and listing the technology that's needed. This ultimately allows us to assess the strengths, weaknesses, and risks, and then prioritize what we need to do to mature. And then we can ultimately take some of those things and convert those into scores. And, you know, we can even, you know, down the road, break that out. And we can maybe say, okay, based on each phase of the DevOps model, you know, where do we stand as an organization? You know, and then where do we stand with security? So you know, just however an organization does it, it's just to say that, you know, breaking things into like their smallest parts and being able to reduce things, you know, a little bit more and approach them systematically is one of the best ways to start on that path to maturity.
John, before we maybe going back to the prior slide, you know, one of the things that, you know, we stress is that, you know, you know, if you look at and begin to understand the DevSecOps model, then, you know, again, there's no question that there's different activities that need to occur at each of those phases. There's tools involved with the different phases, and that's where, you know, breaking that, you want to call it that problem, that you know, pretty daunting, you know, activity into those various chunks, you know, allows you to understand and like, you know, John was describing, grading yourself, you know, and inventorying what you do and don't have, and that can be very eye-opening, because again, it is something that, you know, if you just look at it as a whole, you almost don't have a good sense of where to start. And, you know, by taking an approach like this, taking stock of where you're at, and being objective about what you do or don't have in place, then that begins to allow you to start modeling how you could invest in this and be responsive to the needs of the business. And that's something that we'll have further conversations about as part of this presentation. But that's really the ultimate goal, is to understand your current state, so that you can project into the future where you want to be at what point in time, based on whatever those priorities are and what you have to do from a risk perspective. So thanks, John.
Yeah, I mean, it can be a daunting process when you look at it at first, because there's a lot to it, but there is definitely plenty of good resources out there. And I can't stress enough, any resources that out there that are experts in the field, or anything like that, there's plenty of good resources to latch onto out there to learn more about the process and how you can assess, grade yourself essentially as an organization. So finally, what we achieve through a mature DevSecOps model? I guess that's, the big question. We go through all this. Well, what does it do for us? Ultimately, improving team dynamics and cross functionality between those teams. I can't say enough about this. I mean, you're unifying teams when you're integrating all these processes throughout, the DevOps or DevSecOps model. So, one of the things that we've seen, with organizations that we've worked with, and it's, especially me too, being a traditional systems engineer, the first time I ever got into DevOps, I was just a systems engineer somewhere, and it was a move to the cloud and re-architecting our application stack. And I had never worked that closely with developers, and it was a really eye-opening experience to see what their perspective and viewpoints were on things, and how they differed from mine and why they differed. So it's really a great experience being able to, break down those silos and work in a cross-functional way. There's a lot to be learned, and there's a lot more efficiencies that can be made. I mean, in talking to them and hearing what their challenges were, and knowing that I inadvertently a lot of times created those challenges, and then vice versa, with them as well. It really helped us kind of hash out a more efficient process of development to deployment.
Yeah, I think as part of that too, you begin to understand the dependencies that exist between the different teams, through that whole life cycle. Also, as part of that, there's an opportunity to, prioritize things, have a common language that everyone is speaking. So if everyone's familiar with the overall life cycle, going back to the dynamics, it allows everybody to really identify where those potential constraints are, and trying to anticipate those depending on the profile of the solution being developed, and really then begins to just kind of feed on itself as that maturity continues to develop.
Yep. We also achieve compliance through automation. Again, easing some of that pressure off of the security team, really easing the pressure off of everybody. The more that you automate, the more you can kind of set it and forget it in a way. You always have those audit controls permanently in place, in a sense. The more that you can codify and the more that you can automate. Effectively following business processes. So it's one thing to make a process. It's one thing to say, like, yeah, our organization, requires people to do X, Y, or Z. But how many times do we see a lot of those things fall by the wayside? Like, somebody will make a policy or say, like, hey, from now on, we're going to do, this way, a request has to come in here, and then this person says, okay, and then it gets to this person. How many times that's not effectively followed? Again, through compliance, through automation, through codifying things, we can have the business as a whole more effectively follow business processes as they become more built in and integrated, meaningfully implementing effective tools. Same thing, almost how many times, was piece of software implemented, like for monitoring, or some kind of other tool that was implemented, security tool or something like that, and it just didn't get effectively used because there wasn't somebody either properly trained, or it relied on a dependency, security person, the security side of the house says, hey, we need a tool that's scanning this, but the thing that it's scanning, they don't know much about, and the team that doesn't really care about the security tool. You lose a lot of that inefficiency when you go to a DevSecOps model, because you do have that cross functionality and you have the teams working much more closer together, so you are able to attain a more meaningful implementation of tools and get more effective results out of them. And finally, just iterative reassessment and improvement. As we build these processes out, it's cyclical. Just as the model looks, it's all cyclical. So it's a constant pattern of evaluation and improvement on your processes.
Yeah, and it's definitely not an event. It's a journey. It's something that you have to continue to do and work on. As far as the reassessment piece of it, by going through and doing it iteratively, it provides an opportunity to also demonstrate that the tools or the processes that you're putting in place, or even new roles, are in fact making an impact by going through the whole cycle of reevaluating and reassessing, so that you can demonstrate progress, set targets and objectives of what you want to achieve that can help in your budgeting process for whatever the different phases of the overall approach or program are. We didn't mention the word program, but this is probably more of a program as far as an overarching approach. And then again, helps to, especially if you tie the risk component in there, allows you to demonstrate that you are making an impact and meeting the obligations that you have as an organization as well.
Yeah, I like that you touched on the word program. That kind of brings us to the end of this. But in our next segment, how do I DevSecOps? There's a lot more focus on the program aspect of that, to Frank's point. So, I mean, really, that's what this ends up becoming. If it's done properly and it's really integrated, as it becomes a program within your organization. So, I'd like to thank everybody for sticking with us through this segment. And we do have another segment coming up on how do I DevSecOps, to kind of go over what we do with those results of the assessment, and what's the next step on that, and how we develop a program around it.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, John.
Yep. Thanks.